Hello, everyone, and hello to my students in ethics and critical thinking classes. Again, this is your professor, Dr. Ilag, and I welcome you to this philosophy lecture series. This is lesson 7, and our topic today is the birth of philosophy in ancient Greece. This topic elucidates the issues concerning the discovery of the ancient controversial philosophical problem such as change and permanence. Here with us are our ever faithful friends, Philo and Sophie. Please let them greet you once again. Hi everyone, I am Philo. I am passionate and I represent love. Hello there, I am Sophie. I am wise and I represent wisdom. We have a lot of surprises for you today. So please get ready as we will share with you some fascinating stories in relation to the birth of philosophy. To start off, Philo and Sophie engage us with this widespread phenomenal issue among the millennials today, particularly the Filipino millennials. It is about their controversial question. When I first heard this question, I was happy and excited because this is connected to my discussions in philosophy. I guess everybody knows this question because it is being expressed not only in real scenarios, but also on social media, and it has something to do with love. This is the question. Meron bang forever? So here, Sophie is asking Philo, do you believe in forever? Meron bang forever? And Philo answers Sophie, this is the fact, that only change is forever. So you will notice that Philo's answer is somewhat apathetic. He seems not interested or he is indifferent toward the question. In fact, his answer sounds sarcastic because it contradicts itself. By saying that only change is the forever is also saying that there is no forever at all. Ironically, the millennials are asking the question jokingly, but you can sense the feeling of sadness and regret behind their question. The word forever is an assuring promise of love. You and me forever. There is a statement here and let me read it for you. For every hour I need you. For every minute I feel you. For every second I want you. Forever I love you. Wonderful. Good to hear. So sweet. But in reality it is just a false hope. For most of the time human love fails. And if ever it succeeds, surely, sooner or later, it will end. Truth hurts, but human love is not eternal. It is not everlasting. This is the sad story about human love. So, what do you think is the kind of love that remains forever? So, Philo and Sophie provided a set of objectives for the orderly discussion of our lesson today. Please allow me to read this for you. The birth of philosophy in ancient Greece. In this lesson, we are going to discuss the significant events that emerge in relation to the birth of philosophy. Particularly, we will guide you to understand clearly the gradual transition from mythology to philosophy, which signaled the birth of the latter. Demonstrate how the birth of philosophy discovered the phenomenal philosophical problem such as change and permanence. Discover how the philosophers from different periods would attempt to offer solution to the problem, and contemplate using your deepest thought about our quest for a kind of being which cannot be subjected to the processes of change. Philosophy was born in ancient Greece. Now, the birth of philosophy was signaled by the gradual death of mythology. In the previous lessons, I briefly narrated to you the transition from mythology to philosophy. I told you that there is philosophy because there was mythology. It means that philosophy was just a reaction from mythology. Time came when the early Greeks did not trust anymore their gods and goddesses, perhaps because they couldn't answer anymore their significant questions like change and permanence. In other words, mythology fell short in providing sufficient explanation for their queries, so they decided to find a new way of believing and doing things. In mythology, the early Greeks were interpreting the world events through supernatural explanation. To say super is to mean above, and natural to mean nature or science. Therefore, to say supernatural is to say that their explanation was above the nature, and it was baseless as it lacked scientific evidences. The new way of believing and doing things was initiated by the pre-Socratic philosophers, particularly Thales, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and others. And that was roughly around the 6th century BCE. In fact, Thales was considered as the first cosmologist or the first natural philosopher because he was the first to wonder about the world. These pre-Socratic philosophers were significant to us because they took the initiative to put forward the revolutionary theories about the natural world. Now, to further explore what happened in ancient Greece, let us use a map. So this is the map of the ancient Greece. Well, we have a lot of stories to tell about this map, but for now, we'll focus only on some concerns, especially on the importance of the Mediterranean Sea. So the Mediterranean Sea became the training ground for the early Greeks. It was the place for them to go, to get fit, and to practice their skills in relation to their economic and political activities. So it was the place where they traded, and also it was the place where they raided. Traded referring to their economic activities, and raided referring to their political activities. We should remember that the early Greeks were sailors and fishermen, and not farmers in the first place. It was because their land during that time was not suited for farming. It was mountainous, rocky, and the travel across the terrains were so difficult. So the early Greeks came to depend on the sea. Now, was that a negative condition? I don't think so. For me, the early Greeks' case as sailors that time was a blessing in disguise because it paved the way for the faster and effective spread of their rich culture and civilization during that time. For you to appreciate more the importance of the Mediterranean Sea, here is the bird's eye view showing the location of Greece. Well, known as the sea in the middle of the earth, it is situated between southern Europe and northern Africa. As I mentioned a while ago, farming in Greece were not practical, so the Greeks' final option was to utilize the sea. Now let me reiterate that the condition of the Greeks during that time was not a disgrace, but it is a blessing in disguise. Because as fishers, sailors, merchants, it became more possible for the Greeks to propagate their culture and civilizations to the ends of the world. Indeed, the Greeks are blessings to the entire humanity, and we are lucky as heirs of that legacy. I want to show you another map of Greece, but this time it is the map showing the significant voyage of Apostle Paul from Jerusalem to Rome. Well, I included this in our discussion because later on it will help us understand what made it possible for Thomas Aquinas to admirably synthesize theology and philosophy. And that was between 1225 to 1274 AD. Rome, of course, was the meeting place. On the one hand, Paul was an instrument for transporting the faith from Jerusalem to Rome, Well, it is also good to mention at this point that it was Emperor Constantine who accepted Christianity and proclaimed it as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, on the other hand, Greece was the cradle and seat of the influential reason or philosophy of the Greeks. And although Greece was under the Roman Empire during that time, it was not oppressed by Rome, ironically. Instead, it was its influential culture which became one of the principal components of Roman imperial culture that spread throughout Europe. So in 1225 AD, the angelic doctor, the great synthesizer of theology and philosophy, who argued that when reason ends, faith begins, was destined to be born in Italy. Our next question is, why was philosophy born in Greece? And there are two general reasons to answer the question. One is economic stability, and the other is political stability. By economic stability, richness was not only about the wealth of the Greeks, but slavery also, because during that time, slavery was a common practice. So let us remember that servitude was widespread in Greek antiquity. In Athens alone, in the 5th and 4th century BC, there was an estimated 60 to 80,000 slaves. So you can imagine each family having 3 or 4 slaves to work on their behalf. Now, by political stability, we've learned so much about the Greeks as tough men in terms of their battles and wars. Therefore, the bottom line of these two conditions was freedom. Of course, such a condition made it possible for them to simply lie down along the seashores or under the trees or simply think about anything they would wish to think about. And for that reason, philosophy was hailed to be a luxurious activity. So, class and everyone, we are lucky because what we are doing right now is a luxurious activity. Now let us consider the most important prerequisite for philosophy to be born, and that is the faculty of wonder. This has something to do with your first activity posted on our virtual class. I required you to read the book Sophie's World by Justin Gardner, and I told you to focus on the subtopic The Top Hat. I encourage you to imagine yourselves as the microscopic insects under the rabbit's fur. I then challenge you that it is your defining moment and your deciding moment whether to just stay comfortably under the hairs of the rabbit or to climb up to witness and be amazed of the open surroundings above the far, while at the same time gazing at the magician's eyes. Now, to wonder means to be curious about the things around us, and curiosity alone can prompt us to ask questions. Remember that you can only philosophize if you ask the question why. Now, philosophy began in Miletus, and Thales was the first to wonder about the world. So Thales was the acclaimed first philosopher. Pythagoras, though, was also claimed as the first philosopher, and that is by virtue of coining the term philosophy. Here, I would like you to focus on Thales. He was the first to break away from mythology. He did it by using the natural world, using his natural reasoning. So he is considered as the first cosmologist and the first natural philosopher. In fact, he was the first to ask the primordial question about the world, such as, what is the primary world stuff? What are the basic elements which consist the world? Nowadays, this question may sound silly or nonsense. I mean, if you are a busy individual, then you would never ask this question, as it is just a waste of your time. But as already mentioned, they couldn't afford to waste their time because they had complete freedom that allowed them to ask the most fundamental questions about the existence of the world and about our human existence. Now let me introduce to you a word, mythos. Mythos represents mythology, and prior to Logos, it was mythos. Mythos is a certain way of thinking that places the world in the context of its supernatural origin. In the case of Greece, mythos explained worldly things by tracing them to the dramatic acts of the gods of Mount Olympus. As I previously explained, all events were interpreted by the early Greeks using supernatural explanation. For example, the reason for a bountiful harvest would always be attributed to the workings and activities of the gods of Mount Olympus. Here is another word, logos. Now, this is the word that we place at the end of a field of study like psychology and sociology. And it means the study of, the science of, or the reason for studying that particular field of study. So logos as a reason represents logic or philosophy. Now this Greek word designates a certain kind of thinking about the world, a kind of logical analysis that places things in the context of reason and explains them with a pure force of thought. Philosophy then became the intellectual processes that dealt with the world in terms of logical reasoning, meaning they did not use anymore their supernatural explanation, but they employed a sensible natural reasoning. Now, the practice of such intellectual skill necessarily led the Greeks to the encounter of wisdom, or the so-called Sophia. So, philosophy was not only born, it was also nurtured and carried out. And for that reason, Greece became the cradle of the Western philosophy. Now, let me invite you to a much deeper understanding of the Greek word logos. This is to show you how serious the Greeks are when they use the word or concept. So, literally, logos means word. Now, at this juncture, allow me to mention the three evangelists in the New Testament Bible, namely Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So the first three are called synoptic gospels because when you look at these three in one sweeping vision, they are almost the same in terms of content and structure. But the fourth gospel by John is interestingly different from the three, also in terms of content and structure. Now let me read a portion of this Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. So you notice that it sounds very philosophical, right? Here, you can now witness the interplay of faith and reason in this biblical passage. That word, according to John, was the Logos, the eternal Word of God who became flesh and lived among us. That Logos or Word is none other than Jesus Christ, who later on further interpreted as the personified wisdom. Now, why does this Johannine writing sound so philosophical? And this is our reason for that. It is possible that John the Apostle had a Greek descent or Greek ancestry. Now, let's go back to our main question. Why was philosophy born in Greece? Why not in other countries like Egypt, Russia, Israel, or the Philippines? For one reason, there was no censorship in Greece. There was a complete freedom in Greece, such as freedom to speak, freedom to write, and freedom to think. So the case of Jesus when he was in Judea is a good example. The priestly class were always there to censor everything he was doing. And for that reason, nobody in that place can start to philosophize. Alright, so once again, why Greece? Why was philosophy born in Greece? For another reason, the Greeks' imagination had always been so fertile and concerned with intimate detail. A good example was the description of Achilles' shield, which literally took up 4 pages of the Iliad. Now, here again is the question. The question is very insistent. Why Greece? Why was philosophy born in Greece? But finally, we come to the focal point of our discussion. So, the Greeks were particularly aware of change, especially the war of opposites, summer to winter, hot to cold, light to dark, but the most dramatic of all is life to death. So, when the Greeks began to focus and observe the workings of nature, they encountered the phenomenon of change. And when they realized this, they were restless, anxious, and to exaggerate, traumatized. Heraclitus was the one who observed that everything is changing, and the only constant is change itself. This is an empirical claim, meaning it is happening experientially, and for them, it was literally traumatizing. Now look at the typical Greek lying down under the tree. He is observing the falling leaf. The falling leaf has become the symbol of change, and whenever they see it, they are reminded of the unstable condition of nature. Now, of all the changes, they were specially concerned with the transition from life to death. It seems that humans are simply born in order to die. Therefore, with change, life is simply meaningless. So Simonides said, generations of men fall like the leaves. So according to them, our life is just a monotonous nonsense life because generations are simply replaced by the next generation. Now, if everything is changing, then what can we hope for tomorrow? For instance, why are you attentively listening to me on this lecture video, knowing the fact that tomorrow will be a different story? Why are you doing good things? For what reason? For whom are you offering all the good things that you do? Now, if you say, for your loved ones, sorry, because your loved ones will also simply pass away. What then gives you the motivation to move on if the future is uncertain? This situation therefore clamors and demands for something that is permanent, the so-called forever, to cling on in order to find meaning to our human existence, without which everything is totally meaninglessness. So Philo reminds us of what Heraclitus said long time ago. You cannot step twice on the same river. It means when you do it once, and then that's fine. But doing it again is completely a different story. Nothing stays the same. Now in the history, Heraclitus was depicted as the Dark One, and his ideas were interpreted pessimistically. They were viewed not only as a philosophy, but it carried along the mood of sadness and despair, and the mood of nostalgia and loss. You cannot go home again, reminds Sophie. This thought of Heraclitus is really disturbing. Can you go home again tonight? No more, because the case when you left your home this morning is completely different from the case when you will arrive your home tonight. The previous situation is already completely gone. Heraclitus says, the only constant is change, and your present is slipping away from you. Nothing is ever the same. Here Philo and Sophie reiterate that everything is changing, or the natural world is in the state of constant flux. The problem of change and permanence is formulated this way. If everything changed, then nothing was permanent, and if nothing were permanent, nothing could be studied or understood. But if the world contained a permanent entity, then it could not change or account for any change that took place in the world. So everything is changing. But if so, then what remains in unchanged? What gives the universe permanency in the face of all these changing aspects? Now, the Greeks were driven to pessimism, but luckily, they did not give up. Yes, during that time they were in crisis. However, the Greeks understood crisis as skrenein, which meant a decisive moment or a turning point, meaning they were face to face with two options, either to move on or to give up. But instead of giving up, they all the more demanded for explanation. The Greeks were tough men because they possessed the inner strength to handle their problems. I remember when I was taking up my master's study at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, Quezon City. That time, there was a book fair at the UP College of Education. Then I saw a little book. As I browsed the book, I read the subtitle which said, "You don't need a hospital." And I said to myself, this is interesting. So I bought the book and I read it when I came home, only to find out that it was all about the practice of yoga. It talks about chakras and the 12 seats of power that reside in us. Its message is, if we will only learn to recognize and invoke those natural powers that lie inside us to heal our sickness or our weaknesses, then we don't need a hospital. Then I suddenly realized that the Greeks were like that. They learned to rely on their own human power and inner strength. So in the midst of their confusing and traumatizing moment, they did not give up. The birth of philosophy revealed the crucial philosophical dilemma during that time, which shaped and reshaped their understanding of the nature of the world. Such philosophical dilemma soon preoccupied the minds of the following philosophers coming from the different periods of philosophy. They are the pre-Socratic philosophers, Socrates and Plato, and Aristotle. Now, to give you an advanced idea in the coming lessons, Aristotle, being the focal point of our discussion in philosophy, advanced the concept of the prime mover, or the final cause, a kind of being that cannot undergo change. Could that being be the forever that the Filipino millennials are looking for? The Greeks' conclusion that change meant meaninglessness cannot be blamed, as their condition that time was helpless. They didn't have religion to tell them about the true God, as they relied only on their gods and goddesses. Perhaps we are born today in the world wherein most of the problems are already given solutions, so change is not a problem anymore. But many believe that behind these changing things is Aristotle's telos, the prime mover, and the final cause, as the source of all changes, but itself is unchanged. So for Thomas Aquinas in the medieval period, that must be God. Now, as we end our discussion, Sophie is asking again Philo. Philo, do you now believe in forever? Meron bang forever? Philo now has a revised answer. I think so, Sophie. Now I tend to believe that the telos of Aristotle can be the ultimate forever. This time, Philo anticipates the solution to be offered by the different philosophers, especially that of Aristotle's solution. So until here, and thank you for listening.